At dusk under a sky ablaze with orange and purple, a beautiful private jet sits on the illuminated tarmac, ready to welcome its guests. The atmosphere is one of luxury, from the expensive suites to the strong scent of perfume, all of which clearly show the high status of the passengers. Soft laughter mixed with confident footsteps on the red carpet leading to the cabin. In that beautiful scene, a simple man with an old coat and a faded backpack quietly walked up the metal stairs. His gait was leisurely, full of confidence. His face was calm and expressionless. His messy black hair and unshaven beard made him look out of place among the noble and powerful people around him. Inside, the jet's refined cabin featured beige leather seats, minimalist chandeliers, and even a sleek bar on the side. The passengers had already settled into their seats, engaged in shallow conversations about investments and the latest extravagant acquisitions. Leading the in-flight service was Alexandra Weston, the impeccably dressed chief flight attendant, whose uniform was spotless and perfectly pressed. With years of experience on private luxury flights, Alexandra had developed a sharp instinct for identifying important passengers. As her eyes scanned the cabin, they landed on the man in the worn coat. Her brow furrowed slightly. Something's off, she thought. His simple attire and faded backpack didn't fit the lavish setting. Perhaps he was just an assistant to some wealthy tycoon. What Alexandra didn't know was that this quiet man was none other than Sam Bennett, the true owner of the airline she was serving. And this flight was about to become a journey she would never forget. Alexandra Weston had honed a sharp instinct for identifying passengers on board over years of serving high-profile flights. Her keen eyes swept across the luxurious cabin, evaluating each individual based on appearance and demeanor. When her gaze landed on Sam Bennett, she couldn't hide her skepticism. Something about him didn't fit. His worn-out coat and faded backpack slung over one shoulder made him stand out awkwardly among the impeccably dressed elite. He certainly didn't look like someone who belonged on this flight. She watched him quietly as he took a seat by the window, his expression serene, as if completely unfazed by the luxury around him. He looked like someone accustomed to traveling, yet there was still something mysterious about his presence that made her uneasy. Unable to shake her doubt, Alexandra leaned toward another flight attendant and whispered, "Are you sure they checked the passenger list?" Her colleague blinked in surprise. "Of course he's on it." Still unconvinced, Alexandra cast a wary glance back at Sam, biting her lip thoughtfully. Perhaps he was someone's assistant, a personal aide to a wealthy tycoon. Sam noticed her skeptical gaze but didn't seem bothered. He met her eyes briefly, offering only a faint smile before turning back toward the window without saying a word. The aircraft door sealed with a soft hiss, and the engines purred as they prepared for takeoff. Alexandra resumed her usual routine, making sure all passengers were settled comfortably. She served champagne to two business executives seated in the front row, then moved on to a lively group of investors further down the aisle. When she passed Sam's seat, however, she deliberately ignored him. Sam didn't react. He simply tilted his head slightly as if finding her behavior amusing. As the jet gathered speed and lifted gracefully into the sky, Alexandra stole another discreet glance at him. The bustling city faded beneath the clouds, but the same question lingered in her mind. What was this man doing here? Alexandra had no idea that this quiet, seemingly unremarkable passenger was about to change her life forever. Narrowing her eyes, she silently questioned, "What is this guy doing here?" The thought lingered, but she brushed it off, unaware of how significant this encounter would become. The plane glided smoothly through the sky as passengers comfortably settled into their luxurious seats. The in-flight service had commenced, and as always, Alexandra maintained her impeccable posture. Moving gracefully down the aisle, she carried a bottle of expensive champagne, carefully filling the glasses of the most important passengers. The soft clinking of crystal flutes mingled with hushed laughter and the steady hum of the engines. When she reached the row where Sam Bennett was seated, her gaze swept right past him as if he were completely invisible. She didn't bother offering him a drink. Sam observed the situation calmly, showing no sign of surprise or offense. He simply folded his hands in his lap and waited patiently. A few minutes later, as Alexandra passed by again, tending to other passengers, Sam politely raised his hand and spoke in a courteous tone, "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water?" Alexandra paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to Sam with a mix of impatience and disdain. In a cold, detached voice, she responded, "Only priority passengers receive full service." Her words echoed subtly in the quiet cabin, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who cast discreet glances, sensing the tension. Seated 2 rows away, a businessman furrowed his brow, clearly intrigued by the awkward exchange. Sam, however, remained unfazed. Instead of reacting with irritation, he offered a small, knowing smile, as though he'd seen this sort of thing before and already knew how it would end. Sam Bennett tilted his head slightly and murmured, "I see," before turning back to gaze out the window as if nothing had happened. The businessman seated nearby observed the exchange with growing curiosity. Something about Sam nagged at him. There was a strange familiarity in the man's demeanor that he couldn't place. Frowning, the businessman adjusted the buttons on his suit, trying to pull a distant memory from the back of his mind. Yet before he could say anything, Alexandra had already moved on, ready to offer her attention and hospitality to those she deemed truly deserving. The businessman narrowed his eyes, still unsettled. That guy looks familiar, he thought. But Alexandra had shifted her focus to her next interaction, completely disregarding Sam. The flight continued smoothly, with passengers engaging in light conversation, quiet laughter, and indulgence in the luxurious in-flight service. Yet amid this polished harmony, one glaring detail disrupted the scene: the way Alexandra treated Sam. She didn't just ignore him, she made a point of subtly yet deliberately showing that he didn't belong in that refined environment. Seizing an opportunity when passing by his seat once more, Alexandra decided to escalate matters. She halted beside Sam and, with a professional yet faintly condescending tone, remarked, "Sir, this area is reserved for exclusive clients. There are available seats at the back of the cabin." Sam calmly lifted his gaze, his expression serene yet perceptive, as though seeing beyond the surface. "I'm fine here, thank you," he responded firmly but without a hint of confrontation. His composed reply only served to irritate Alexandra further. She was used to passengers complying without question, not calmly asserting themselves in defiance of her authority. Alexandra was used to passengers who always followed her instructions without question. For a brief moment she hesitated, but then decided it wasn't worth insisting. She walked away, muttering something inaudible to the nearby passengers. The businessman, who had been watching the entire scene, became even more intrigued. He noticed Sam's composed demeanor and the way he handled the disdain without reacting or retaliating. This made the businessman furrow his brow in thought. A few minutes later, Alexandra returned, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle, her face carefully neutral though her patience was wearing thin. As she passed by Sam, he shifted slightly, unaware that his shoulder barely brushed against the cart. It was an almost imperceptible contact, but Alexandra saw it as an opportunity. With a swift motion, she tilted one of the bottles on the cart, causing an entire glass of ice water to spill over Sam. The cold liquid soaked his coat and part of his shirt. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," Alexandra said in a falsely apologetic tone, though a faint, satisfied smirk lingered at the corner of her lips. All eyes were now on Sam. He glanced down at his soaked clothes, took a deep breath, and then lifted his gaze to Alexandra. He said nothing, simply staring at her. But there was something about that gaze, firm and intense, that sent a chill down Alexandra's spine. Perhaps it was the discomfort from his unwavering stare, or perhaps frustration at someone like Sam refusing to feel inferior, that made Alexandra cross her arms and speak louder, her tone filled with defiance. Alexandra, the head flight attendant on Horizon Airways' private jet, crossed her arms, her sharp gaze sweeping across the passenger cabin. When she spotted the man in the worn jacket, she didn't bother to hide her contempt. "You're a fraud, you don't belong here," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. The surrounding conversations died down. A businessman sitting nearby frowned, his eyes sharpening. He'd seen this kind of scene before, an arrogant person misjudging their target. Alexandra continued, her voice dripping with disdain, "People like you always try to worm your way into a world that isn't meant for you. They think they can fool people, but eventually the truth always comes out." She tilted her head, her eyes running over the man as if assessing a defective product. "Are you even American?" Silence hung in the cabin like a cold, sharp cut. The man didn't react, simply looking at her quietly. But it wasn't the look of anger or embarrassment, but rather an unusually calm gaze. A nearby businessman raised his eyebrow, about to speak but stopped when he realized the man still hadn't responded. It was also the first moment Alexandra felt a cold unease run down her spine. The man looked down at his damp jacket, then slowly looked up, his gaze piercing into Alexandra. He said nothing, but that look sent a chill down her spine even more than scolding words. The atmosphere was as tense as a taut string, all eyes fixed on the two of them. Passengers around them almost held their breath, waiting for something to happen. Alexandra stood up straight, her lips pressed tightly together. She expected a reaction, anger, or even an excuse. But no. The man just looked at her, frighteningly silent. That silence made Alexandra more uncomfortable than any words could have. She let out a sneering laugh. "Are you just going to stare at me like that? Nothing to say?" Her voice was sharp, almost provocative. The man tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the situation from a different angle. When he spoke, his voice was deep but as heavy as a stone. "It's funny. You look at me and see an imposter. But I look at you and see someone trying to convince herself that she really belongs here." Alexandra's eyebrows furrowed. She hadn't expected that answer. The man continued, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet space. "I've met a lot of people like you. People who think that just by putting on an expensive uniform, walking in a stylish way and trampling on others, they will become a part of the world they crave. But do you know what happens? When the uniform is taken off, when the door closes, when the flight ends, you are still just yourself." The silence became even heavier. The businessman observing everything crossed his arms, clearly intrigued. Some passengers in the front rows exchanged awkward glances. But the one most affected was Alexandra. She parted her lips to say something but couldn't find the words. The man looked straight into her eyes, continuing, "The problem isn't that I'm sitting here. The problem is that you're afraid that, in the end, there will be no place for you in this game." His words lifted her up and then dropped her into an abyss. Alexandra's face flushed with anger, not only because of the man's audacity, but because his words had hit the deepest, most hidden weakness in her heart. "Shut up!" she shouted, and in an uncontrollable fit of anger, she swung her hand and slapped him across the face. The slap echoed like a thunderclap, shattering the tense atmosphere. The earlier giggles suddenly turned into shocked whispers. Several passengers gasped, unable to believe their eyes. The man's face tilted slightly from the blow. But he didn't react immediately. Slowly, he ran his tongue lightly over the blood at the corner of his lip, then turned his head back, looking directly at Alexandra. But this time there was something different in his eyes. Not anger, not shock. But an absolute certainty, as if everything had been preordained. The feeling of power she had just held slipped away, and Alexandra felt her stomach twist. For the first time she didn't know what to do. In the front row, a woman took a sip of champagne and then suddenly widened her eyes. "Wait, this person looks like..." But before she could continue, another passenger had pulled out their phone and started recording. A beep sounded. The cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out with. Alexandra's world crumbled around her. She wanted to defend herself, to offer an excuse, but no justification could alter the reality before her. The worst part wasn't just the humiliation. It was the chilling realization that her carefully constructed facade had shattered. The passengers who once dismissed her presence now stared with judgment, their gazes sharp with disapproval. Phones captured every flicker of panic on her face, every bead of nervous sweat forming along her brow. But the person who terrified her the most was Sam Bennett. He had yet to utter a single word since the revelation. He did not rebuke her, did not retaliate. He simply watched. And somehow that was worse than any outburst. With an almost unnerving calmness, Sam reached for his phone, unlocked the screen and began typing. Alexandra swallowed hard. "What are you doing?" Her voice wavered, tinged with growing panic. Sam offered no response. He placed the phone back on the armrest and turned his attention back to the window, as if the ordeal had already faded into insignificance. But for Alexandra it was far from over. The pilot's voice cut through the suffocating silence, this time firm with finality. "We will be making an unscheduled landing." Alexandra felt her stomach drop. The ground beneath her seemed to vanish. "No, wait. Please," she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. But no one was listening. The passengers returned to their seats, their expressions indifferent. Phones remained raised, recording every second. And Sam Bennett, the true owner of this airline, continued to gaze out the window, completely unbothered, as if none of this was even remotely surprising. A heavy presence filled the air as the footsteps of security agents echoed down the cabin. Reality crashed down on Alexandra like a collapsing house of cards. This was it. She was being removed. Her frantic eyes darted around, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, someone, anyone who might intervene. But there was no one. Not a single passenger, not a fellow crew member, not even the pilot. Even he refused to meet her gaze. And Sam? He remained motionless, his attention fixed on the sky beyond the window, as if all of this were nothing more than a minor disruption to his journey. The agents took her by the arms, guiding her toward the exit. "Please don't do this. I can explain," she begged, her voice trembling with desperation. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. As they neared Sam's seat, she made one last, desperate attempt at redemption. Turning toward him, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Mr. Bennett? I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know who you were." For the first time, Sam looked away from the window. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice so calm yet piercing, he simply said, "You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to know how to treat people." The words struck her like a hammer. Alexandra's mouth opened, but no words came. Sam turned back to the window, the matter already closed in his mind. The agents led her away, and as she descended the stairs of the plane, the weight of her downfall crushed her completely. Her career, gone. Her reputation ruined. Her entire future, uncertain. She cast one final glance back at the aircraft, as if clinging to the faint hope of undoing it all. But the door was already closing. Inside, Sam Bennett continued his journey, unfazed, as if this entire event had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of turbulence. For Alexandra, however, the flight had ended forever. As the plane landed at its final destination, passengers disembarked in calm contemplation, still digesting the dramatic turn of events. But outside, Alexandra's story was already spreading like wildfire. The video of the slap, the passengers' stunned reactions, her public disgrace, it had all gone viral. Social media was ablaze. Meanwhile, Sam Bennett walked through the terminal, his well-worn backpack slung casually over one shoulder. No entourage, no security. Just another traveler among many. But the world was watching. A cluster of journalists spotted him, racing forward, microphones extended. "Mr. Bennett, can you comment on the incident aboard your flight?" He paused, considering the question as cameras flashed in rapid succession. Then, with a quiet, composed voice, he replied, "People often mistake luxury for money. But true luxury is in how we treat each other." The journalists exchanged glances, sensing the weight of his words. He continued, "Money can buy a seat in first class. But respect, that's something you have to earn." With that, he gave a small nod, smiled politely and walked away, disappearing into the bustling crowd of the airport. The interview spread like wildfire. Thousands shared the video of Sam's quiet but powerful statement on respect and humility. The hashtag luxury is respect trended worldwide. Meanwhile, Alexandra's fate was sealed. Her dismissal was made public, her face plastered across news sites and trending discussions. Any hope of a fresh start now seemed impossible. But Sam Bennett's words became something greater. In a world where wealth and power often dictated influence, he reminded people that true greatness lay not in status, but in how we treat those around us. And while social media continued to debate the incident, Sam had already moved on, boarding his next flight, living his life without the need to prove anything to anyone.